Good evening, everyone. My name is Danielle Apfelbaum, and I'm the Scholarly Communication Librarian at the Thomas D. Greenlee Library. Thank you for joining us tonight for the third virtual STEM poetry reading series at Farmingdale State College. Funded by a 2022 Students First grant, this virtual series has two primary goals. First, to expose the FSC community to the work of poets writing about or working within STEM. And second, to enhance the FSC's community engagement with STEM majors at FSC through conversation with authors about the synergistic relationship between STEM and poetry. Before we begin, a few notes. Currently, camera and microphone access is disabled for attendees. If you wish to make comments throughout the reading, please feel free to utilize the chat feature. If you have questions for our readers, please utilize the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those questions at the close of the reading. Please note that this reading will be recorded and made available via YouTube. If you'd like to receive a reminder when the recording is available, please use the reminder form that I will be popping into the chat very shortly. It's just a Google form link that you can fill out, and I will make sure that you get reminders before the reading. Finally, if you've been to a poetry reading in the past, you may note that ours has a bit of a twist. Each of our poets will read approximately 20 minutes, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about the synergy between poetry and STEM work and vice versa, and we'll end with a little challenge for the audience. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first poet, Jessica Reed. Jessica Reed's chapbooks include Still Recognizable Forms, Laurel Review Green Tower Press, and World Composed, Finishing Line Press, finalist for the Etchings Press Whirling Prize. Her work has appeared in Conjunctions, Chicago Review, Crazy Horse, Quarterly West, Colorado Review, Denver Quarterly, Bellingham Review, New American Writing, Inverted Syntax, Waxwing, Diagram, Pank, Scientific American, The Journal, Laurel Review, Exposition Review, North American Review, the Indianapolis Review, and elsewhere. She has an MFA in poetry and a BS in physics, and she teaches a university seminar on physics and the arts. She lives in Indiana with her husband and chickens. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle, for the invitation to be a part of this. And thank you for putting this together. I'm a fan, science and poetry, so it's really wonderful that you've done this. And it's an honor to be reading tonight with Lucille. So I look forward to hearing your part of it as well. So I guess I'm gonna try to time myself. I'm pretty terrible with time, so I'm just gonna kind of try to keep track. So, all right, I'm gonna dive in with my Scientific American poem, which is a mother-son story that I really like to share. I think it's very special. Corey Gray is an astrophysicist at LIGO, which is where they detected gravitational waves. 1.3 billion years ago, two black holes collided and caused ripples in space-time, and they were detected here on Earth in 2015. And Corey Gray asked his mom to translate the press release. His mom, Sharon Yellowfly, is a member of the Siksika Nation, and he asked her to translate the press release into Blackfoot, which is a disappearing language, her language. And it's kind of a feat because Blackfoot did not have an existing vocabulary of physics. So there's a chance to invent new words, which is super fun. So the theory of relativity is beautiful plantings, and physics, everything that encompasses the word physics is observing where we came from, the sun and the stars. So, which I think is beautiful. Some other words like black holes, she used black and hole to combine, but many of the words she had to make up. So the sound that black holes make when they collide, the sound that the instruments make, they call it a chirp. So like a bird. So, and this poem also has to do with a glacier. So here we go. As the Knud Rasmussen Glacier calves, a woman translates gravitational waves into Blackfoot. When we first detect the chirp of black holes colliding, She renders the press release into disappearing language. Light splitter and union of instruments speak interferometer. Self-strengthened lights exploding speak gamma rays. Such subtle bird songs are undone by gravitational waves. We are compelled to fix their fugitive features. In glaciers, nature deviates and also runs its course. Its layers not quite memory, but artifice. Snow's structure changed under so much weight, the geometry of flakes collapses. Heavy cold, compressing air, deforming fern. The cold is a formalist. It constructs a made thing, temporary, describing ancient climate feedbacks as it melts. How elusive the object, how we read impermanence in layers of ice so compressed its expansion can shatter glass, of ice so deep you can no longer discern sequence, its layers folding and sliding into the nonlinear, as effortful as astrophysics in Six Sigma, somehow still legible. We must consider and reconsider freezing and thawing, a girl punished for speaking in her native tongue, the defiance in resurrecting an idea whose circumference swells and contracts, an artifact of water and sky, revealing the dual meanings of sublime, its magnificence, its vaporizing solidity, which, I say, is proof of something if it doesn't save us. Okay, and yeah, when I say effortful as astrophysics, there's actually video of Sharon Yellowfly on YouTube reading the press release, and you can tell it's a struggle. She's open about it. It's difficult to pronounce the language, so it's really cool that Corey and his mom did that. So this next poem is about the second law of thermodynamics, which says that all systems in the universe tend toward disorder. So if you think about it, it's really the most depressing law in all of physics. That's my joke I always tell, but that's entropy. And this poem is scheduled to go to the moon. I don't know when it's going to happen. The launch keeps getting delayed, but this is the last poem in my first book, World Composed. Oh, and if you're a Shakespeare fan, you'll recognize scraps of Shakespeare in it. Entropy. And when my light dissipates from my temporal skin, having astonished me to the bone, my body is the frame. The physical system described completely, laws will remain, and thin air will be inhabited by the facts of this configuration of atoms in this time particular. I have fixed my attention on those fissures of the fractured eggshell and not on time's forward arrow. So should the lines repair. Cracked here and here, the calculus of where this flawless ovoid is determined to break, transcending before and after. Time's pencil keeps me still, tracing actual over possible. But once the lines have been traced, I will be amazed at what was ever possible. Outside, it is growing cold, and yet I have astronomy, the sun, time, my barren rhyme. Okay, so this next one is a little bit longer, and I'm watching the time. There are kind of two voices in it, so it's harder to act out, but on the page, just try to imagine, one column to the left is about the cave that I'm about to tell you about, and on the right, there's a speaker observing birds landing in her lawn. So the cave, the epigraph says most of it, but this is something I read about shortly after the pandemic started. Carl Zimmer's A Planet of Viruses pretty much opens with this cave of crystals in Mexico, and it blows my mind. So I'll read it. It's in Spain, so La Cueva de los Cristales, and my Spanish is probably terrible, but here's the epigraph. Inside the bare Sierra de Nica Mountains, there is a chamber 1,000 feet underground, lined floor to ceiling with gypsum crystals high as telephone poles. This cave had been sealed off from the evolution of life on our planet for millions of years and was open to us for only 15. Discovered in the cave's water were viruses, 200 million in every drop. Sorry, I continue. I write from a point of astonishment, and I continue to be astonished by this story. Colossal crystals formed in darkness where two waters touched, groundwater, surface water, magma heated, oxygenated, one drinking the other's oxygen, a seeping into, saturated with sulfide ions, silently precipitating into one crystal, dissolving into another that began to tower. Oh, wake up, wake up. Something moving through the air now, something in the ground that waits. And this place, strangely lit, so hot and so humid, a person could set foot inside for just 10 minutes before cells would die and organs fail. I open my door. Birds panic at the interruption. Crystals soft like fingernails, but razor sharp and searing hot. We carry the light down with us, that we might see a world that never sees sunlight. Without the birds, their constant narration, we know our looking brings its own light. So what is beneath our world when we are not looking? A hell entered willingly, here a fragile clarity. Infernal cathedral, the crystals, an archive of Chronos and Kairos. Hush. The iridescent wholeness we break by entering. Our flashlights, our cameras, our eyes, without which crystals do not sparkle. Our lamps brighten, crystals 12 tons, 500,000 years in the making. We might, with dilated vision, see an underworld flaming forth. Penny, our microbiologist, uses a corkscrew and lighter, the equipment that will function at this depth, to get samples of these virus-harboring waters. Viruses? From where? And no animal large enough for us to see with bare eyes could see them. What did they feed on? No, they did not feed. Viruses bide their time, and this, a temple of time. To imprint this temporary, perishable earth into ourselves so deeply that its essence can rise again invisibly inside us. Did the cave of crystals panic at the interruption, sealing itself off from us again? Its superlative scale, orders of magnitude, huge beams jutting out. I took photos of the crows, who did not see me seeing them, pecking my lawn in disturbing numbers. Another, an overwhelming sense of how dare they. Viruses embedded in our genome make our air, regulate our seas, affect our planet's temperature, our soil, our freshwater. Another. Is it meaningless to ask what the world looks like when I'm not looking? The innumerable, am I using the word right? Count the viruses per drops per cave sector, all estimates, and it not needing to be known. We first made viruses visible to us by crystallizing them. Early 1900s, clear sheets with needles of protein. We found they could be stored like table salt and later reanimated. I didn't want to scare the birds away, not yet. In a now inaccessible cave in Mexico, mammoth crystals, microscopic creatures. These are the scavengers, the birds that appear when death is near. And here, the indisputable evidence that my lawn is not my lawn, and neither is this story mine, of momentary opening, glimpse of an alien world, then collapse. Okay, and there was a Rilke line in there and a line from Jory Graham, so credit. All right. So here's a shorter poem to balance out that long piece. So this is called I Once Was Dry Light. I once was a sun's ray, especially in summer and at noon. I was reflected and concentrated in burning glass. I was as between mountains or through walls. I once was a hollow in a mountain, was a violent motion, a natural motion. I was absolute. Steam and hot smoke was air itself, a furious heat. Once I was air shut up underground in caverns, especially in winter, where wool was close to a fire for a time. I was sparks from flint and steel sharply struck, was yoke beams and wheel axles. I was wet hay stored and catching fire. I was iron dissolved in a glass without use of fire, was the inside of an animal, was horse shit, fresh animal excrement. Once, strong oil of sulfur and marjoram and egg white in distilled wine. Once, I was a skinless part of the body, eye or tongue, was a burning old nasturtium, I was vinegar and acid and a wound, even the penetrating cold of the north wind, which burns. Okay, so this is one I've never read out loud. This is in my newer chapbook, and it came from attending a science lecture from a conservationist and research chemist for the Library of Congress. It's pretty random that I attended this talk, but she was talking about crystal flutes in their collection and the way these crystal flutes were aging and cracking in very specific ways. It was all very particular chemistry, but she had slides and she had delicious vocabulary, so I soaked it up. And just like I'm trying to write about Blackfoot and gravitational waves, and suddenly I'm writing about a glacier. This happened here. I was trying to write about the crystal flutes, and I end up writing also about coral and algae, and how with coral bleaching, the proteins that I'm trying to get this right. If the proteins fluoresce in coral, and some surface waters, it acts like a sunscreen, but in deeper waters, that same fluorescing protein can actually help the algae that it is symbiotic with kind of photosynthesize. So I don't know, this juxtaposition. So at still greater depths, the coral's fluorescent proteins supply algae with light. Chrysil, the glass flute collection in the Library of Congress, begins to fog, an effect of light scattering on the cracks. London Gazette, 1676, some flint glasses observed to chrysil and decay. Laurent's flutes en cristal, built to withstand heat and humidity better than wood and ivory instruments. But the conservator finds spalling accretions. Compare French crisser to crackle. An X-ray analysis reveals most flutes are not crystal with its lead flux, but are composed of a less stable, inherently unstable potash. In red pants that cut off mid-calf, her dark curls held up in a barrette, she describes the way condensation clouds, diffusing into the glass and leaching alkali ions. She projects forms of cracking on a screen. Parallel, a fine network, the devastating hexagonal arrays of mud cracking. Does this display phase of death, the potash fluxes announcing their presence, bear semblance to the fluorescent sunscreen emitted by coral in a bleaching event, radiating rays away from its algae in an act of self-preservation? Perhaps diminutive of craze. What does not endanger the integrity of the glass matrix? Preservation is not to undo, but to arrest. 200 years exposure to ambient atmospheric moisture, to build new housing, a kinder climate, always the effects of heat and water, dialectical, scaling on the surface. Here, the conservator elicits the presence of another. The flute's head joint is most damaged, exposed to the player's breath. Okay, so that's a stranger poem, but yeah, I forget what I was going to say about it. So I'm trying to find a poem to end on. I think I'll do Light Pendant Singing from the first book. There is language in here from Virginia Woolf, from Shakespeare, from Henry Vaughan. I don't have my source list. I'm pretty sure that's everyone, but Tom Andrews, well, St. Augustine via Tom Andrews. Tom is the reason I'm a poet. So, Light, pinned and singing. I am finally present. As Virginia said, my eyes are hard. Years ago now, in optics lab, my partner's strange pronunciation of frosted glass. We were looking at spectra then, glass-shattered light lines. But I couldn't focus. Those radiant projections, just as dazzling as their sources, the glisten of one borrowed from the other. And elsewhere, gaseous auroras, both southern and strange. They'd been there the whole time. Facts may not shimmer, but they are star-like occasions for metaphor, even if I have to bend them a little. That white celestial thought. Virginia warned us all, the light is fitful. White beams of winter, wind compresses snow into hard barricades. Shakespeare said, fires singe my white head. In kitchen sinks and pressure chambers, we manufacture 14 shimmering forms of ice. See, I believed Tom when he said, there is indeed some light in us. We seek to explain it, lest our own fitful light dissipate, star-like in its collapse, with each photon no longer so startlingly distinct. And I forget what I was going to say about. I was going to say something about it, but it's already gone. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So with that, we will introduce our second reader. Give me just one moment to switch the spotlights. Hold on one second. Let me check. There we go. So our second reader is Lucille Lang-Day, who is the author of 4 poetry chapbooks and 7 full-length poetry collections, including Birds of San Pancho and Other Poems of Place and Becoming an Ancestor. She has also edited the anthology Poetry and Science, Writing Our Way to Discovery, co-edited Fire and Rain, Echo Poetry of California, and Red Indian Road West, Native American Poetry from California, and published 2 children's books and a memoir, Married at 14, A True Story. Her many honors include the Blue Light Poetry Prize, 2 Josephine Miles Penn Oakland Literary Awards, the Joseph Henry Jackson Award in Literature, and 11 Pushcart Prize nominations. The founder and publisher of a small press, Scarlett Tanager Books, she received her MA in English and MFA in Creative Writing at San Francisco State University and her BA in Biological Sciences, MA in Zoology, and PhD in Science Mathematics Education at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Lucille.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Well, all of my poetry collections and all of the anthologies I've edited contain some STEM poems. So I'll read today from 4 different books, starting with this collection, Infinities, which consists completely of science and nature poems. And I'll start with a poem called Birth of the Universe. Lying on a quilt I should have washed weeks ago, I try to picture it. Nowhere, a speck of nothing explodes. Burning with the heat of billions of stars condensed to a point, the universe cools, inflating exponentially for less than a second until it reaches the size of a grapefruit. Imagine it, a grapefruit, Still too hot to hold, it blows off energy, then grows more slowly. In 3 minutes, particles are scattered like seeds across millions of miles of space. Atomic nuclei sprout on the first day. Atoms take shape in the millionth year. The fiery blossoms of stars appear a billion years later. The heater kicks on as I think of the firmament. Easier to contemplate than God or angels, electric currents create magnetic fields that bend the currents. Lacy filaments with current flowing down the center and around the outside become galactic arms, weaving spiral patterns through the eons. And when the massive stars run out of fuel, they contract to black holes where wormholes burrow into new universes, and each worm finds an apple tree, sweet with white blossoms, growing wild. Firm and red, the apples ripen, their flesh pale as that of the woman who takes one to honor creation. And next, I will read a poem called Homage to Henrietta Swan Leavitt and Annie Jump Cannon. The first computers, spinsters, who scanned photographic plates at Harvard College Observatory in the late 19th century, recording the colors and brightness of stars in fine Victorian script. Barred from taking classes and earning a degree, one woman could catalog 500,000 stars in a lifetime betrothed to the universe. An ordinary person might have cursed all the elements in the spectra. Their work considered too menial for an astronomer, the women knew the sky more intimately than anyone. Henrietta's world was Cepheid variable stars. She watched them day after day, growing dimmer and brighter through weeks and seasons, grains of salt on dark plates, until the sky told her, the brighter the star, the longer the cycle will take. And she showed the way to measure distances between galaxies, even light years from Earth to the edge of space. Every fact is a valuable factor in the mighty whole, Annie said. And she told the astronomers how to classify stars by temperature and color. OBAFGKM. Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me, the students would say, missing the irony. And the blue-white, white, and yellow-white stars beat like pale hearts, millions of light years away. The yellow, orange, and red ones, colder, were closer now, familiar as lemons, oranges, and apples glowing on the breakfast table in a black lacquer bowl. And those women actually had the job title computer, and they did work that's done today by electronic computers, scanning the photographic plates from the great observatories. And in general, through the centuries, women have done a lot more scientific work and have made more discoveries than they've gotten credit for. And credit was late in coming to Henrietta Swan Leavitt and Annie Jump Cannon, but they eventually did get credit for their very important work in astronomy. So the last one I'll read from this collection is called Fear of Science. I have no fear of Dolly, whose genes came from the nucleus of a starved mammary cell, or of tomatoes sprayed with gamma rays to kill maggots, worms, and salmonella, or of mice whose mutant myosin disrupts the alignment of muscle fibers in the heart. Nor do I fear the frog and carrot cloned from mature cells long ago, or the outdoors where cosmic rays bombard my DNA and radon gas emerges from the earth, or people with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy whose heart cells are in disarray. Should I fear grain stacks where chlorophyll molecules capture light in an oak leaf? Or the sunbeam itself, dancing photons arriving after a long journey through space? Or the beat of my own heart, squeezing blood one way through its 4 chambers? I don't even fear the way neutrons from a uranium nucleus cause fission of a second nucleus, changing mass to energy, making a chain reaction possible. And certainly not the electrical signals traveling like thoughts through silicon chips. What I fear is the imperfection of the human brain, quick to anger, oblivious to the needs of frogs and carrots, mice, oaks, sheep, confused by too much or too little dopamine, unable to remember clearly the color of manroot, the cry of geese. And now I'll read just one poem from my collection, Becoming an Ancestor. In this book, the poems are about my ancestors, my contemporary family, and mortality. And the issue of mortality raises the importance of time. And this poem is called Essay on Time. Time fills a horned lark, singing its riff of high-pitched notes by a field of silver hairgrass whose spikelets shine like bright metal on a winter morning. It's the telomeres at the ends of chromosomes shrinking with each division of every cell of the hairgrass and lark until the cells can't divide. It's the San Andreas, a strike-slip fault deep beneath the field, stretched out like a serpent that will rouse to gulp down hairgrass and houses. It's also the sun, whose light falls evenly on the field, a yellow dwarf star that someday will become a red giant, boiling away Earth's water. What is time but the universe, a self-creating vacuum studded with suns and planets that sweep in their orbits like the hands of billions of clocks? Time flies, divides, trembles, burns, arises from and returns to nothing. It holds the dead close, while the lark sings this morning and stars blink out. And now I want to turn to this small anthology that I edited. It contains poetry and essays, and it's called Poetry and Science, Writing Our Way to Discovery. It includes my own work and also the work of 4 other women poets. And I'll read 3 poems from this collection. The first one is called Of Love and Light. And this was inspired by an article I read in the New York Times that said scientists could now bring light to a full stop, hold it, then send it on its way. And the poem is about both love and the science of light, and it includes bits of language from Robert Burns, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, and Shakespeare. Forged in the ancient hearts of stars, it shimmies through space for eons to illuminate the sea, for the man and woman leaning into each other at the end of the pier. The sun floods Earth with it too, pure energy filling the sky like a porcelain bowl, spilling minuscule beads to bounce off petals, leaves, and the throat of a hummingbird into cone cells of my retina, saying, send the message like a red, red rose to the cortex now. It's the reason for shadows of willows dancing in wind at the edge of a pond, and the product of 2 bodies raised to white heat, daring me to see a soul at the white heat. Streaming from the moon's face, it reveals 2 roads converging in a yellow wood, but conceals the Milky Way. 2 candles beating like hearts in silver holders, created from paraffin and dark air, small household gods standing on the buffet, crammed with invisible color or teased into a rainbow, singing in vibrant shades. It's not time's fool. It always wins the race, yet slows to a stop in chilled rubidium gas, disappears like a stalled dream or lost possibility frozen in space, until after years of experiments and wrong calculations, you find warm arms around you at dawn and know you're done running in place. And the next poem is called Global Warming in the Galapagos. I had the good fortune to visit the Galapagos in 2017. 3 years without rain, and incense trees are gray, leafless in what should be the wet season. Without the trees, where will red-footed boobies with blue beaks build nests where fluffy chicks can hatch? Even prickly pear cacti, looking so much like clusters of spiny ping-pong paddles, are turning brown and dying. What will happen to iguanas that eat the cacti and lava lizards that nibble lice from the iguanas' necks and backs? A warming sea also brings El Nino, with too much rain flooding overheated currents where penguins can't find fish and beaches so hot that green turtle eggs can't hatch. When iguanas can no longer regulate their body temperature, giant tortoises and blue-footed boobies will gather like refugees and strike out for cooler land. And the sad truth there is that when the Galapagos become too hot for these creatures, there might not be a better place for them to go. And the next poem I'll read is called Lost Languages. And as I was writing this poem, I wrote my way to an understanding of the fact that the loss of species and the loss of languages on Earth are linked. It isn't just Hittite, Trojan, Sumerian, or even Mohegan, Yana, and Natchez, all long gone, but also the hundreds that have slipped away since 1950, while the last Madeiran large white butterfly flickered among the trees of the Lori Silva. The last West African black rhino ran across the savannah, chased by poachers after its horn, coveted as an aphrodisiac in China. And the last Javan tiger, stripes rippling, was poisoned, its forest habitat cleared for rice. Lucille Rubidoux, last surviving speaker of the Osage language in Oklahoma, died in 2005. Marie Smith Jones, last speaker of EAC, died in Alaska in 2008. Biologists say 99.9% of all species that ever existed are now extinct. Perhaps the same is true of languages. Who knows what Cro-Magnon said to one another in sickness, love, or fear? Now, so many ways of dreaming and perceiving are disappearing, but as Mojave, Comanche, Bolo, and Bison slip away, so do salmon, salamanders, rainforests, and redwoods, and even the speakers of English, Russian, and Chinese become one with the red wolf, mongoose, numbat, and tarsier in their fate. So as I was writing that poem, it really came home to me that it's the same forces of capitalism and habitat destruction and globalization that drive both the loss of species and the loss of languages. So I want to conclude, if there's time, with 3 poems from my latest poetry collection, Birds of San Pancho and Other Poems of Place. And the first one I will read is another Galapagos poem, and this one is called What the Tortoises Know. On Genovesa, as my husband lay, on the beach of Darwin Bay, a sea lion came to sniff his toes, and a red-footed booby sitting with her chick in a mangrove nearby let me get kissing close. On North Seymour, the frigate birds weren't fazed by me, and a young blue-footed booby was intrigued by my walking stick. On Espanola, the sand was so thick with iguanas it was hard not to step on them. The guide explained that the animals here don't fear us, hawks and short-eared owls being the only predators evolution has bred them to know. They first saw humans with guns and bows just 500 years ago. But giant tortoises who live to be 150 years old have seen how we kill to make boxes and combs, so heads and legs withdraw into shells at the sound of a loud voice, and they grow still as clean-picked bones. And the next one is called What Flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Melted snow from the crests of the Rockies rushes past pinyon pines, limber pines, lodgepole pines, corkbark firs, ponderosas, gathering silt as it reaches bur oaks, cottonwoods, staghorn sumacs, silver maples, passes prairie cordgrass, winds through cattails, duckweed, skunk cabbage, finally to mingle in the Mississippi with water draining from 31 states, where hunter-gatherers lived with bison herds for 10,000 years. Now the river carries oven cleaner, human feces and caffeine, medical residue from hospitals and laboratories, scouring powder from soap from millions of houses, antibiotics from all the cattle ranches in the Midwest, solvents from farm machinery plants, pesticides from corn and soybean fields, ingredients used to make plastic, enough estrogen from birth control pills to bend the genders of fish, thousands of tons of herbicides, fertilizers that cause algae to form massive green carpets in the Gulf, which leads to an explosion of bacteria that decompose algae and kill everything in an area the size of Massachusetts each year. All this even before 206 million gallons of oil from the Deepwater Horizon blowout, before hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil dispersant containing chemicals that destroy red blood cells and cause cancer. It all enters the shimmering, translucent bodies of arrowworms and dinoflagellates consumed by oysters, the algae scooped up and eaten by shrimp, the crabs that crush mollusks and shrimp with their chelipeds, the sea bass whose stout jaws clamp down on any smaller creature. Of course, it's in our blood and hair and fingernails. It floats in our hearts and permeates our brains as surely as hope or anger. It's in your body and mine, these molecules that cling like lovers to our bones. So I don't write poems like that to say, look how we've ruined the earth, but more to say, look, we've got to do something about this, because ultimately I think all environmental problems do have solutions. And I will conclude with a poem called I Am Amazed. I am amazed by the Arches cluster, the most crowded place in the Milky Way, jam-packed with stars 25,000 light years from Earth in Sagittarius. By Earth whirling through space, the only planet known to have free oxygen, liquid water, whales, wallabies, and redwood forests. By a single redwood tree, 350 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter, standing above the Pacific, since Herod was exiled to Gaul. By a single redwood needle flat with 2 silvery bands on its underside and inner machinery endlessly churning out ATP. By a molecule of ATP, which carries energy in all the cells of people and trees, a currency required for love and breathing. By 2 children, a boy and a girl, playing under the tree, who spot a speckled woodpecker with a red patch on its head, tapping the bark, igniting a blaze of amazement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucille, and thank you both so much for sharing your work. I'm just going to switch back over to the slides where we have a couple of questions to chat about. So just give me one moment and I will pull those back up again. Okay, so again, thank you so much for sharing your work. And one of the reasons that I wanted to start the series was in part from reflecting on the intersection between my work in information retrieval and poetry, which I studied as an undergraduate and absolutely loved. As a librarian, I need to be able to quickly and efficiently retrieve published literature on topics that are both within and very much beyond my area of expertise. And my ability to construct complex but concise search strings, I think in many ways, comes from my study of writing and revising formal poetry, more so than any of the metadata courses I've ever taken. I think if I hadn't studied poetry, I probably wouldn't attend as closely to the selection and arrangement of my words in search strings as I currently do. And as a result, I don't think that I would achieve the same precision. So along those lines, I have a couple of questions for you, and you can answer all of them. You can answer just one of them, whatever makes most sense for you. But I thought I would ask you first, how does reading and or writing poetry impact your work in STEM fields and or how you think about STEM related topics and work? How does your work in STEM fields or with STEM topics impact how you read and or write poetry? And what do you think poetry brings as a medium to the exploration of STEM related topics? So that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, those are rich questions. I've been trying to think how to approach it, and I did watch I watched Lisa Rosenberg and TJ Jarrett, which is one of your previous episodes of the series, and they were both coming at it from a technical kind of perspective, which it seemed like they were using traditional forms or meter or even syllabic constraints, that sort of thing to help them construct. And so there's this extreme precision with the poetry, and I appreciate that as a someone who studied, a very rigorous discipline. But I think in my own work, it mostly comes from what Einstein called a sense of the mysterious. It's just a general sense of wonder and, awe. And it almost seemed, I was really struck listening to Lucille at so many of the same themes, the astronomical themes, women in astronomy. My whole spring semester is about, we begin with the Harvard computers and Leavitt and on, and disappearing languages, destruction of habitats. And so it seems like there was a good pairing tonight in that there's a lot of similar preoccupation with scientific ideas, sort of romance with the ideas. I don't want to speak for Lucille, but I just saw a lot of overlap in the subject matter. But that's where I'm coming from anyway, as a sense of wonder, awe, mystery, and I just keep dipping in. I just keep reading and finding things that amaze me. So.
And I'll add to that there's just a tremendous amount of overlap in the mental processes used for poetry and for science, and that using these mental processes in one of these fields transfers to the other, and you get better at both. And I'll give some examples. For example, the unexpected is really important in both science and poetry. You have to be able to let go of your preconceptions and be ready for the unexpected, or you just don't get anywhere in poetry or science. In science, you have to be ready to accept experiments that don't turn out the way you expected, and you have to reformulate your hypotheses and even your theory. And similarly, in poetry, you have to be open to where the poem wants to go, and you might write your way to an understanding of something that you didn't really fully understand before, and you're also sharing that with others at the same time. And also, the poem might take a different form than you expected. You might start out by writing a sonnet, and it could become free verse, or vice versa. But having the poem take you where it wants to go. An example of that is my poem "Lost Languages." I started out, I just thought I was going to be writing about lost languages, and then the lost languages and lost species converged for me, and I understood all of it better. And also in both science and in poetry, you have iterations. You in a science experiment, if you're in a high school or college course, it works the first time maybe, but in real life it doesn't, and you have to keep adjusting variables like temperature and light and pH if there's water involved. All kinds of things, whatever kind of experiment it is, have to be adjusted, and then you try it again. And similarly with a poem, you keep revising, you keep making it better. And so I guess that same kind of sticking to it is important in both poetry and science. So should I keep talking, or
Sure.
is that
No,
okay.
I'll second that, with persistence and sustained attention, openness. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'll read just 2 paragraphs. This is my book, Poetry and Science: Writing Our Way to Discovery, and these are 2 paragraphs in my essay that tell more about the same mental skills in poetry and science. I realized that poetry uses all of the same mental skills as science, plus more. Poetry uses logic, reasoning, observation, and knowledge, just like science. Logic in poetry, though, is not necessarily linear, inductive, or deductive. A poem can move by association, and it can move in a circle. It can break up grammar and reshuffle the parts of speech as surely as a chemical reaction breaks up molecules and reshuffles atoms. Science uses intuition, just like poetry. A famous example is chemist August Kekulé's realization that the benzene molecule must have a ring structure, an idea that came to him after he had a daydream of a snake biting its own tail. Also, like poetry, science involves aesthetics. Scientists and mathematicians often refer to the beauty of an experiment or proof. And I think one thing that poetry brings to that science doesn't have is a full acceptance of emotions and emotional reactions. So most scientific discourse frowns on bringing in the emotional responses, but I think actually emotional responses can enhance our understanding of something, and it can make it more memorable, and it can also draw people who aren't so interested in science into science. So I think that emotions are really important because we want to interest as many people as possible in science. We can't be an informed citizen today. We can't decide what to eat or how to vote rationally without knowing anything about science.
There was great. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, it's just on that on that note, there was a great piece in Scientific American, I want to say 1991, by John Tim Payne, called The Poetry of Science. And it suggested this same thing, this idea that poetry can bring home the human import of scientific ideas. And it was a real, I read that in high school. It was a real call for me, to explore both.
Yeah, that's great. I just agree with that wholeheartedly, obviously. And I think poetry should be used in science at all levels, in elementary school, high school, college, graduate school, because it adds another dimension to it. You can't do away with scientific papers and textbooks and lab reports and things, but poetry is really another medium that can be brought in and enhance the understanding and study of science. And it can even enhance work in science, because poets can make pre-discoveries that can later be proved by science. And some examples are that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a piece called Eureka, a prose poem in 1848. And in that, he predicted black holes, the Big Bang, and the expanding universe. And scientists had not thought of these things yet. But Poe turned out to be right about all of that. He was a poet. And so, and also Poe was the first person to solve Abler's paradox, which is why, if there's an infinite number of stars, why isn't there an infinite amount of light? How can we possibly have night? And Poe figured out that the universe must be finite in time and space, and that allows it to get dark at night. So, and I'll just give two other examples of poets, making pre-discoveries. Walt Whitman, back when, the mind and the body were supposed to be two separate things, in his poetry, Walt Whitman said that mind depends upon flesh. Mind comes out of flesh. And this was a scientific idea before its time. And Gertrude Stein showed that the neural structures that we use for grammar are independent of the meanings of words. And she made this pre-discovery before linguists thought about making a case for that.
It's so much of, oh, sorry, I was just going to say so much of what you mentioned resonates with me, because in putting together the grant for this series, I ended up finding a lot of research, not a ton, but quite a bit, particularly as it relates to poetry and learning. There were articles about using poetry to foster empathy in nursing students. There was an article about how physiology students had better retention when they engaged in writing limericks about a particular function of the body and area. Mm-hmm. So again, so much of it resonates when you talk about poetry also as part of the learning process. And also I wanted to just touch on the idea of being ready for the unexpected. Right now I'm going for my PhD in education, and I've been focusing a lot on qualitative, and it's coming from areas where I focused a lot on quantitative, this idea of letting themes emerge from the data instead of having this preset notion of what you're looking for and what you may find and what it all means. I see a definite parallel between educational research and poetry.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely.
I think, that's true. That's true of all kinds of data. We just have to be ready for the unexpected, just like we are when we write a poem.
Yeah, and I've even in doing some research for other things, I've come across forms of qualitative research where they actually put the data into poetry as the report, which I find absolutely fascinating. I was doing a completely different project and stumbled across that. And I think it also speaks to, the point before about bringing people in who might not necessarily think they're all about science, but doing it so in a narrative format with language in a compelling way, has a lot of merit, And conversely, I think this is something we touched on a little bit in the last reading, the idea of poetry as fostering critical thinking about the fact that there always is a speaker behind a scientific article. It's not just, the facts and nothing but the facts. It's, an experiment or a study through the filter of a particular scientist working in a particular paradigm with particular experiences. And you do have to sometimes think of that as a speaker when you're going into, evaluating that article. And I think sometimes we don't do that. We'll interrogate a poem, but we won't necessarily bring that kind of thinking to a scientific work. And I think that's so important, especially nowadays.
Absolutely. I love poetry to trigger critical thinking. That's great.
Okay,
can I show and tell something?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I just want to plug this book by Madhur Anand. So this poet is a chaotician. So she's a mathematician who studies ecological habitats. So this is her day job, and she's a poet. And then this book, Parasitic Oscillations, which just came out, I think, just this year, 2022. She has poetry, but also graphs of phase space where she's modeling ecosystems, and she'll take language from actual scientific papers, her own and others. And then by the end, so there's an extensive analysis of birds. So she's got pictures of birds, specimens in the book, but some of them have QR codes on them. So just to try to do something completely novel and experimental, here's, I hope you can see. Can you see that? Oh, I don't even know if I'm on screen, but there's a QR code on this bird.
Yes, I can see, like right by the neck area, right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. I just think if you're looking to inspire young people, this is a really rich intertextual kind of example of a complete blending of science and poetry.
That's awesome. I will make sure to put that in the notes when I post the video to YouTube.
Yeah,
Awesome.
So I'd like to get that book myself.
It's great. Yeah.
All right. So with that, it's been a great discussion about the interplay between STEM and poetry. So I would like to ask you, you can do one or the other or both, but what is one thing you would like attendees to take time to consider with regard to the intersection or synergy between STEM areas and reading or writing poetry? And or if you'd like to challenge our attendees to write a poem of their own, what prompt might you suggest?
Okay, well, I'll suggest a prompt for writing a poem, and that is to take a scientific word or concept that interests you, that you've never seen in a poem, and that you think maybe nobody has ever used in a poem, and then write a poem using that word or that concept. And it doesn't have to be, the poem doesn't have to be just about that concept. It doesn't have to explain that concept, but just let that concept or word appear in the poem.
You stole my prompt. That was going to be I always dare my students to use some scientific language that they wouldn't think had a place in a poem, and to put it in a poem. But I have a backup prompt then, since that one was used. My prompt, so I had that poem, I Once Was Dry Light, and it was a list of things, like especially in summer and at noon, I was reflected and concentrated in burning glass, etc. That came from a table in Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, which was like a 1600s, one of the foundational texts about science, but it was just a table of heat. And it read like poetry to me. So I just kind of used that table. So I would challenge people to kind of hunt for a table in a textbook and see what they can pull from it.
Yeah, and another idea, moving ahead. Well, I like that the table prompt very much. Another idea is to, find a science article in a newspaper and write a response to that. Write, not just about the article, but you can bring in your own feelings, your own life. You can bring in quotes from other poets, whatever. But just use that article in that science article in the newspaper as a springboard.
That's great. I'm definitely going to try those, and we are going to encourage our students to give those a try. It has been a wonderful evening of poetry, of discussion, of audience challenges. I would actually like to turn it over. We still have some time to our guests to see if they have any questions. To our guests, if you have a question, you have two options. You can use the Q&A function, or you can just pop your question in the chat. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And while you're doing that, I just want to share again, there is a reminder form. So if you'd like me to pop a reminder right in your inbox every time we have a reading, which we will start up again in the spring semester, you can just fill out this form and I will make sure that you get a reminder prior to the reading. But any questions or anything we didn't? Is there a question that you had hoped I had asked and I did not ask this evening? I always like to ask people that. What should I have asked that I did not ask that you think is important for our students when thinking about poetry in STEM?
A question, I don't know. A takeaway would just be that there's absolutely no reason to see poetry and science as anything but the best of friends.
Absolutely.
I agree with that completely. And I actually started writing poems that contained science in 1971 when I was 51 years ago when I was a senior in biology at UC Berkeley. And at the beginning, I would show my poems to poets and scientists, and a lot of people thought I was off my rocker. It was like, what? This isn't poetry. You should be writing about daffodils, or.
Oh, no.
But now it's the thinking and the understanding of this has come a long way, so that people really understand and accept that that science and poetry are good friends, just as Jessica says.
And you were, even if your friends weren't recognizing the genius of what you were doing, you were in such good company because Marianne Moore was a biologist and a poet, and she's the one who told us that poetry gives us imaginary gardens with real toads in them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I'm looking at the chat and the Q&As, and I'm not seeing any additional questions, but no worries. If you have a question, you can go over to our YouTube page and I will forward it to each of you if a question arises after the reading. But I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your work and having this discussion. It has been great, and I know that our students are really going to enjoy this in the replay in their classes. So again, thank you so much for being part of this series.
And
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Jessica. I just loved hearing your poems.
Thank you. I feel likewise. Thank you so much.